Good afternoon. I'm Randy Bandman, chair of the Entertainment Law section of the Beverly Hills Bar Association. Welcome to the Business of Television, 8 Strategies from Hollywood's Past to Carry It into the Future by Ken Basin. Beverly Hills Bar Association's Entertainment Law section is sponsored by Lawyers Mutual Insurance Company. It is my honor to introduce you to Ken. Ken is a longtime executive leader in the television industry, innovating new models in content licensing and production management across head and senior business affairs roles at Paramount Television Studios, Sony Pictures Television, and Amazon Studios. Recognized by Variety as one of Hollywood's new leaders, and by The Hollywood Reporter in its annual Next Gen Executives 35 Under 35 feature, Ken most recently served as global head of business operations, film and television at Riot Games, where he also executive produced the second season of the Emmy Award-winning Arcane. Ken is also the author of The Business of Television, the leading reference guide about the television and streaming business for working and aspiring industry professionals. Thank you very much, Ken.
Thank you. As Randy said, if you have questions along the way, drop them in the Q&A. If I have an opportunity to work them in as we're going through the presentation, I'll do that. But we'll also save a little time at the end for more open Q&A and follow-up. So you'll hopefully get a second chance, and we'll try to address as many of those as I can get to. Thank you, everybody, for coming. Little bit of extra background. I wrote the first edition of The Business of Television in 2017 and 2018, and it was published in summer 2018. And the kind of closing note of it in the conclusion is what, in hindsight, kind of reads as a fairly naive, a little Pollyanna-ish sort of call to the future and the capacity of kind of innovators and deal making and business models, and to help the industry through what already looked certain to be a challenging time. And the second edition has a little bit more of a cynical and jaded tone. A lot of that did not ultimately unfold the way I had hoped over the last 6 years. And I found, as I was working on the second edition, and especially on the conclusion, that rather than having kind of such a forward orientation, I was looking back a lot more and really thinking about, the mess that the industry overall is in as part of a process of taking business models that had really kind of fundamentally worked for decades and throwing them out the window with no real plan for what would replace them. Sort of a follow the leader game among the major companies, a lot of panic among the traditional entertainment companies. To this day, what are we going to do with these very, very wealthy Silicon Valley companies that have come to eat our lunch? And so where I think about things right now is that there is a path forward and there is a path to stability, but it actually starts with looking backwards and reevaluating these business models, kind of appreciating what worked about them and how they can be adapted for the future. And that's not to say that there's not room for genuine innovation still, and that, the industry has to be the way it's always been. The industry has never been the way it's always been. But in the kind of short to medium term, stability can really come from understanding what made our business work before it felt like it suddenly stopped working. And that's really the focus of this presentation, is what are the big things that we can recapture and readapt for the streaming age to, as an industry, collectively get our feet back under us. And so, as it says in the title, there are 8 that we will go through over the course of this, and they actually break out into roughly 4 different categories. Those of you who've seen the book, this is adapted from the conclusion, but updated and reframed. And, I was just lamenting to Randy before we started, the problem with the book is that it's fixed in time. And this is an industry, a topic that I think is not very susceptible to fixing in a period of time. So even if you have read the conclusion, hopefully I will give you something that you have not heard or seen in there just yet. But again, breaking out these 8 strategies into 4 categories. The first 3 really have to do with monetization. And fundamentally, how do companies make money? How do they make more money than they spend? How do we sort of define success, at least in economic terms, for original content? The next two have to do with what TV we make and how we make it, and really sort of understanding both from a creative perspective and a production perspective, what are some of the unique elements of TV that we've gotten away from that were healthy, and how do we let this business shine for the things that it's good at instead of trying to kind of copy ideas and techniques from other parts of entertainment that may not have been a great fit. The next two have to do with relationship with talent, especially writers, but not exclusively writers. How do we have systems to share success, and how do we kind of build a foundation for the ongoing vibrancy of the TV business and of the creation of new content in the future? And the last has to do with the relationship with the audience. And what is kind of the both the value proposition, but kind of the pact between the makers and marketers of TV and the people who consume it, and how do we invest in that relationship and make TV as exciting and valuable to people in their lives as it can be. Maybe not quite as it used to be, but as it can be going forward. So we'll just go through these kind of one at a time, and starting with advertising. So um, the first thing to remember about advertising is that it is kind of the foundation on which TV was built for decades. TV for most of the last 25 years, I describe as having a dual revenue model. And there are two basic revenue models in content: direct pay and advertising. So the ultimate example of direct pay is going to a movie theater to watch a film. You buy a ticket specific to that film for your access to it. That money that you spend flows through intermediaries, the exhibitor, the distributors, but there's a sort of a one-to-one relationship between the money coming out of the consumer's wallet and the money that is flowing into the system. And the classic example of advertising is terrestrial radio. Nobody here has ever paid a cent for the things they hear on the radio. They pay with access to their ears, or in the case of TV, access to their eyeballs. And advertising works. It can be annoying to people. I sometimes wonder about the efficiency of it, but fundamentally it works for producers and distributors. It works for advertisers. And it's something that had become deeply, deeply unpopular over much of the last few years. I think there's a lot of the struggles that we see today in Hollywood go back to choices that Netflix made kind of between 2010 and 2014 on how to define streaming as a product, and how to establish streaming as something different from television, better than television, more premium than television, and really wanting to the public to view it as something new. Which I think makes sense for them in kind of launching a product and also trying to create a new consumer behavior. It's easy to forget now because time has moved so quickly, but 10 years ago, it was not a normal thing for any of us to be paying monthly subscriptions directly to a single service for content. We had cable and satellite subscriptions that had multiple channels, but Netflix had to create new consumer habits. One of the things that they did was they tried to define streaming as something that doesn't involve advertising. And that was a choice that really informed how other streaming services were launched, kind of both what were the public's expectations, but what was also the industry's perceptions of the public expectations around streaming. And Netflix, as it is on many aspects of its service, was very almost religious about streaming, advertising not being part of the streaming experience, until their stock price collapsed during the pandemic, and then they had to kind of reevaluate that. And since Netflix has opened the door to advertising, I think the taboo on advertising in streaming has been broken, and that's a good thing. That's a very important way to bring money into the system that has been sorely lacking. And I think that's something that's going to expand in the future. One thing that I think is a really interesting and important fact to keep an eye on as it relates to advertising and streaming, there's this metric called average revenue per user, or ARPU. There's a lot of different metrics that companies and analysts use to measure performance in streaming, but this is one of the most important ones, and it is exactly what it sounds like. What is the average amount of revenue that a streaming service makes for each user? That will often vary from territory to territory. People are not paying the same amount for Netflix in India as they're paying in the US. The maybe intuitive assumption would be that advertising is a sort of less premium product, and it's obviously cheaper. It's offered to people at lower monthly rates. But what we've seen at Netflix, and really I think in all of the streaming services, is that ARPU is higher for subscriptions on ad tiers than on non-ad tiers, meaning the difference in subscription revenue is more than made up for by the ad and advertising revenue uh, from the advertising that is served to people on ad tiers. And so there's a natural incentive towards uh, advertising and to driving customers towards advertising because the companies literally make more money that way. And I think, we're going to see ongoing price increases in streaming, especially in the premium non-ad tiers, because from the perspective of the companies, if they can drive you to the ad tier, as long as they're not driving you out of the ecosystem altogether, they're actually making more money that way, and they can sort of keep on charging until they reach a sort of equilibrium point on the number of people operating in each tier. So the economic incentives are there, and I really think that we are kind of in the very early days of advertising because the industry has not unlocked the technological advantages inherent in streaming. I would just say anecdotally, if you have a mix of ad and non-ad tier subscriptions, as I do, it's not very impressive. The quality of targeting is not very impressive right now. The diversity of ads that are available, you tend to see a lot of the same ads over and over. And these companies are still largely, running a 20th century advertising business under 21st century platforms. And as the engineering improves, as these companies sort of refine the ways they collect data and what data they are willing to share with advertisers, because that is another important kind of old taboo or old orthodoxy of streaming, that data was highly proprietary. Data is going to become less and less proprietary because it has to support the ad business. And as it becomes less proprietary and more sophisticated, the ad product is going to get better, better from the perspective of the advertisers and better from the perspective of the user, all of which I think will tend to drive CPMs, or cost per thousand, the rates that advertisers pay to get 1,000 impressions on one of their ads, higher. They're in a down period right now. And so, again, I really think we are at the very, very beginning of advertising's rise in streaming. And we're already kind of seeing the obvious potential for growth. So these are two charts to kind of quickly reference. One is, you see on the left chart, only 22% of Netflix subscribers are on the ad-supported tier. 78% are on the premium ad-free tier. Again, that is inefficient from Netflix's perspective. And they're going to tend to raise prices on the non-ad folks to make up that difference in revenue, and again, drive people towards ad support. One of the interesting things here is, as you see the sort of flow of this chart from Amazon on the top, having the highest percentage of ad users, to Netflix on the bottom, that reflects the company's strategies as they rolled out advertising. At Netflix, when they introduced their ad tier, it was on an opt-in basis. If you did nothing, you continue to have your ad-free Netflix, and that's what the majority of customers have done. At Amazon, every Amazon Prime subscriber became a subscriber to the ad tier, and they had to make an affirmative choice to upgrade their subscription by, I think, $3 a month to go back to an ad-free experience. And those kinds of just choices on how you roll out, obviously, as you can see, have massive, massive impacts on the allocation of customers between these products. What you also see is towards the top, the services at high percentages of their user base in ad tiers are those that launched later in the quote-unquote streaming wars and launched with ad tiers from inception. Those towards the bottom, Netflix, Max, Disney Plus, they all launched without ad tiers. In the case of Max and Disney Plus, there were explicit intentions for one. Netflix had said that they were never going to do one, but never has a way of not being never. And so a lot of it still reflects kind of the path dependency of where these things started, gives you a sense of how much room there is between there and where they're going. And overall, the value of the advertising market in streaming is going up, despite the fragmentation of the audience, despite, again, the collapse in CPMs. So one consequence, it seems, of Amazon going into the ad-supported business is it flooded the market with a huge amount of ad inventory for video product that wasn't there. And Amazon by itself is so large and has so many subscribers that has moved the market and brought CPMs down across the board. There's a lot of fear about that in the industry that has big impacts on basic cable and linear businesses that are very much degrading businesses, but they're still the economic lifeblood of the entertainment industry. They're suffering from the low CPMs. Again, I think the sort of cure to that is going to be the improvement in the ad products because, we can do things for advertisers and for people seeing advertisements that we've never had the opportunity to do in kind of traditional over-the-air broadcast contexts. So there's advertising. Next is windowing. And windowing is also just a very classic inherent to content businesses. The traditional business model of any content business, be it television, feature films, music, is to make one thing, one creative work, the asset of which is essentially embodied in the copyright, the intellectual property instrument that gives the owner legal rights to it. And then to sell that one thing over and over again as many times as possible to as many buyers as possible over as long a time as possible. And the three kind of metrics that companies would maximize across are media, territory, and time. So it's easy to think about this in terms of the traditional feature film windowing experience that everybody here has lived through their lives and seen change in recent years. A movie is first available exclusively in theaters. Then it might be available for premium high-cost downloads. Then it might be available for more expensive permanent downloads and DVD, Blu-ray, physical media. Then it expands into rentals. Then it's on premium pay TV like HBO. Then it's on basic cable. Not as common anymore, but I used to see a lot more of it still a bit. High-profile movies even end up on broadcast TV, and these things are spaced out over time. In some cases, there were contractual requirements associated with this. The relationships between the studio distributors and the exhibitors often provide for a minimum guaranteed exclusive theatrical window that has been shrinking dramatically in recent years. It used to be about 6 months. It's now as low as nothing. Essentially, 17 days is becoming very common. 30 days is becoming very common. But this was how you made money in content. You sold a thing over and over, and that process that I just described was repeated from country to country for every creative product that had the ability to travel. And especially in television, that model has been completely shattered in the last couple of years by what we call the cost plus deal. So the traditional licensing model in TV, we call the deficit model. So a studio would sell a show to an initial commissioning network or platform in the United States. And that network would pay a license fee that was less than the total cost of production. And they would get a very finite bundle of rights. So this is why, sort of, if you remember watching reruns on broadcast TV, you would see rerun episodes from time to time of ongoing series. But once a series had been canceled and new episodes were no longer being released, the series disappeared from the airways entirely. Even the reruns went away. This reflected the kind of limitations that were placed on the rights of the licensee. And those deals reserved a huge number of rights, both domestically and internationally, to the studios. The difference between the initial license fee and the cost of production was called the deficit. And that was the at-risk capital that the studios sort of needed to make up via this downstream licensing across media, territory, and time. Most shows didn't make it, and most shows lost money. But a few shows that were wildly successful would be disproportionately generational wealth creating private island money wildly successful. And a single Seinfeld or Two and a Half Men could keep the lights on at a studio for literally years. That model broke down in the streaming era as streaming services became worldwide. And as, especially in the early years, they placed a very high premium on exclusivity because, again, the streaming companies were teaching consumers a new pattern of behavior to subscribe and pay for content in a way they hadn't before. And the perception was exclusivity was incredibly important because if a viewer could just wait a couple of years to see the content somewhere else, they wouldn't have the same incentive to subscribe and stay subscribed. And Netflix and Amazon by 2015, 2016 had really grown into bona fide worldwide platforms in a way that the industry had never seen before. And so these companies had really extensive demands for rights. But the consequence of this is they needed to take so many rights in so many territories for such a long time, and they wanted such restrictions against even the few reserve rights that were there, that there was no opportunity for the studios to make money from other opportunities, and therefore no ability to take risk. And so the model flipped from a deficit model in which the initial license fee was less than the cost of production to the cost plus model in which the license fee paid by a Netflix or an Amazon or an Apple to an outside studio was higher than the cost of production of a series. And this had huge downstream effects on things like the market for actor deals and how much actors get paid, the market for overall deals for proven creators, the sort of economic incentives on all sides that flowed from this led to a lot of rapid change and I would argue distortion in other markets. But the thing that they did that I think was more strategically impactful was they functionally ended windowing. And you go back to the earliest shows on Netflix as kind of the first mover in originals in streaming, with the exception of BoJack Horseman, which was produced by Tornante and licensed to Netflix in a very early deal before Netflix had really refined its licensing model. BoJack Horseman has been licensed to Comedy Central for sort of reruns or cable syndication, but you don't really see streaming originals anywhere else in linear. And I think that's a giant lost opportunity. The example, so the standard cost plus license deal gives these streaming platforms exclusive rights for the run of the show, being the entire period that the show is not canceled, making new episodes, plus 10 years from the release date of the final episode. And a lot of the key shows at Netflix from the early era, like House of Cards, ended in 2018, like 13 Reasons Why ended in 2017. I think Narcos also ended in 2017 or 2018. These shows are going to be exclusive to Netflix through 2028. And I've argued that I don't think there's a single person left in the world who is subscribing to Netflix or not canceling their subscription to Netflix because it is the only place where they can watch Orange is the New Black or 13 Reasons Why. Whereas there are, I think, a lot of cable channels, fast channels, free ad-supported streaming channels like Pluto and Fubo that I think are like the modern equivalent of the basic cable universe. That would love to get their hands on these shows, but to the extent that they're owned by the streamers, they haven't been made available to them for licensing. And to the extent that those shows are owned by the streamers' outside studio partners, the deals between the studios and Netflix have to date largely prohibited them from seeking those kinds of opportunities. I think that's a lose-lose, and streaming has always been a place where we see the power of windowing, the kind of mother origin story about, I think in a lot of ways, being Breaking Bad. So for those of you who are Breaking Bad fans and who remember the series relatively well, season 3 ends in very dramatic fashion. I won't spoil it, I guess, but there's a kind of iconic moment where Walter White's on the phone with his wife. She says, "What happened?" And he says, "What happened? I won." And that was written to potentially be a series finale, not just a season finale, because the show had no ratings on AMC. It was beloved by critics and by a small group of committed audiences, but it really was not kind of covering its own costs for AMC in terms of what it paid Sony for that show. And Sony, which has always been very aggressive among studios at trying to save shows from cancellation, bring them to new platforms when an original network gets up on them, basically went to Netflix and confirmed that Netflix would be very interested in licensing the recent seasons of Breaking Bad and was willing to pay good money, and went back to AMC and said, if you give us relief from the restrictions of the existing deal and you allow us to license the show for the non-current seasons to Netflix, we will pass that revenue on to you as savings in your license fee so you can afford to continue the show. And the initial reaction from AMC was one of great skepticism. Why would we do that? Why would we take our current show and make it available for people on other platforms? And Sony was able to persuade them that they were basically thinking about it all wrong, that AMC was still a network that trended very, very old in its audience. Netflix's audience trended very young. The thesis was basically that, especially with the binge viewing opportunity on Netflix, there was a great fit for a complex serialized show like Breaking Bad, that they could find a new audience that would follow the show back to AMC, and that's exactly how it played out. And so AMC, Breaking Bad is now considered this sort of seminal moment in TV and a huge part of the culture. It would not be had that deal not been made to send seasons 1 through 3 of Breaking Bad to Netflix ahead of season 4 debuting on AMC. I see a question. Netflix sometimes doesn't decide to renew series. That's an understatement in recent years. Why does Netflix not allow creators to take new seasons to the series elsewhere? Again, I would just say anytime you're thinking about originals on Netflix or any other channel, remember that some of those are going to be owned by Netflix, which produce them as the studio. For example, Stranger Things, made by Netflix for Netflix. And some of those are made by outside studios. So I used to work at Paramount Television Studios. We produced and delivered 13 Reasons Why for Netflix. The short answer is that Netflix, at least publicly, does not yet agree with me on what I described as what I think are the dynamics and the win-win opportunities of windowing. They've retained a very, it's funny to use the word traditional because we're talking about a market that has only existed for a grand total of about 11 years. But within those 11 years, they've retained a very traditional notion of exclusivity, and they simply do not want to allow their shows to be viewable anywhere other than Netflix. Netflix also, I think, just in general as an orientation, and this is something that John Landgraf has talked about. If anybody heard his recent appearance on the Town podcast, before Netflix, every other entertainment company wasn't trying to sort of like dominate and monopolize and win kind of to the expense of everybody else. Everybody wanted to compete, everybody wanted to succeed, but everybody wanted to sort of invest in a vibrant ecosystem, a rising tide that floated all boats. Netflix has a much more aggressive attitude, and I don't think they would necessarily say exactly this in exactly these words, but they've operated not to sort of be part of a vibrant ecosystem, but to be the last company standing. And if every other media company went out of business and Netflix was the last place making and releasing content, I think they would be just fine with that in a way that, as competitive as Disney and Universal are, I don't think they would ever articulate that as a good goal or a good end state. And so I think Netflix is very much leaving money on the table by not allowing these shows to go elsewhere because they don't want to support or create opportunity for any of their competitors. And I think they just don't subscribe to the idea that the money is worth it to them at this point, or that a healthy overall industry is good for them. It's easy to understand because they are in such a stronger position that, they can survive tough times better than their competitors. And I think hope to outlast a lot of their competitors. But I think it's just a mentality thing. The way that changes is, Netflix has been under pressure since 2021 to start focusing on revenue instead of growth. They've done a very good job of that with the introduction of the ad tier. They've done a very good job of that with the very smooth password sharing crackdown. But eventually, they're going to get what they can get out of cracking down on password sharing, out of the ad tier in terms of generating revenue growth. And then the question is going to be, what next? How do you continue to generate revenue growth? And I think, one of the few, if only available answers at the time is going to be to start monetizing the library. But I think we're probably years away from that from Netflix, but we're not years away from that from Max or Disney Plus platforms that have already started allowing their library originals to be made available elsewhere. And again, you don't have to go back as far as Breaking Bad to see the power of windowing in streaming. The success of Suits on Netflix last summer, I think is a great example of what windowing can do for you. Windowing brings creative content to audiences that may never have discovered it before, who, maybe were just never viewers of USA, didn't even have a cable subscription at the time. But here's this show that, to kind of paraphrase one of the old must-see TV slogans from NBC in the 90s, if I haven't seen it, it's new to me. Suits was new to a lot of people, and it also reflected Netflix's unique power just by virtue of its scale and the quality of its recommendation algorithm to create new audiences for things that have already been out there for a very long time. And there's really savvy ways to exploit this. So I also include here the example of Brooklyn Nine-Nine, and this is one where I would say as a viewer, as a customer, I am a participant in this. Universal Television, obviously affiliated with Peacock. If they have they kind of Netflix all exclusivity all of the time strategy, they would just make sure that all 8 seasons of Brooklyn Nine-Nine are only on Peacock, so you have to go there to see it. But what they've done instead is they license only the first 4 seasons of Brooklyn Nine-Nine to Netflix. Seasons 5 through 8 are exclusively available on Peacock. And, my wife and I had a baby this year, and we're watching a lot of television during the early days of our parental leave. Got hooked on Brooklyn Nine-Nine on Netflix, got to the end of season 4 and said, wait, where's the rest of it? And we went and subscribed to Peacock because we wanted to watch seasons 5 through 8. And we didn't have a subscription to Peacock before that. That is it's anecdotal, but that is what these companies want to happen, and that is what a windowing strategy allows you. And so even though, I assume that the licensing deal between Netflix and Universal was such that Universal didn't make any more money from that license because seasons 1 through 4 have been very, very, very well viewed on Netflix. But they were able to sort of capture the value of that by driving people back to their own platform to complete the show and discover what else there was to discover there. So windowing, I think we've already seen starting to come back and will continue to grow, because I think it's just another good example of where you get out of the orthodoxy that exclusivity is important. You just got to have exclusivity, and you start taking the broad view. It's another area where I think it just helps everybody do better and everybody win. And bundling as the third of these monetization things. So, bundling used to be one of the most important drivers of the success of the entertainment industry. As of 2013, when the era of streaming originals began, the average cable or satellite subscription had 189 channels on offer, and the average subscriber watched 17 of them. And, you know, it's easy to see why this would bother people. The feeling that they're paying for a lot of stuff that they're not actually using. At its peak, if you had a subscription to cable or satellite, you were personally paying about $7 a month for ESPN, whether or not you watched a minute of ESPN, because $7 from every subscription went to ESPN, and it was part of every channel package. And so streaming, tapped into this intuitive, distaste that customers have for bundling and the perception that they're paying for things they're not using. I personally argue that bundling is the model that people don't realize that they actually love. And a really good example of a wide body of, social psychology research that demonstrates time and time again that people are very bad at knowing what will make them happy. And the example that I always use of, if you want to know what an unbundled product experience that is highly efficient looks and feels like, let me direct you to air travel. Air travel used to be a bundled product. You would pay a ticket price and you would get your check bag, maybe your second check bag, your overhead luggage, pick your seat, have your meal, have your drink, get your headphones, get your blanket. You might have used 1 out of 8 of those things, but you were paying for all of them. If you wanted them, they were there. Starting around 15 years ago, the airline ticket became unbundled. All you were buying was your seat, but not necessarily your seat number. Fees for even first check bags. I mean, all these things became pay by use services. And until the highly inflationary environment of the last 18 months or so, if you go back about a year and a half, adjusted for inflation, air travel was the cheapest it had been in a generation and a half. It was a very efficient, cost-effective product. And I think you'd be hard-pressed to find somebody who said they liked it better and that they liked having to, make these decisions. The example that I always use in the content space for myself is I love Top Chef. I watched every episode. I'm obsessed with it. I watch nothing else on Bravo, and I don't think I'm ever going to watch anything else on Bravo. In a totally unbundled world, I have to decide how much is it worth to me to have access to Top Chef and maybe manage opting in and opting out of subscriptions. For me, I like knowing that it's there for the months of the year when I want to go to it. And I think there's a lot of decision fatigue that comes with individually having to kind of price what something is worth to you. Beyond that, I think there's also a dynamic that is unique to content, which is sort of a structural advantage of bundling, which is bundling allows niche content to exist. In an purely unbundled world where everything stands on its own 2 feet, content has to appeal to the broadest audience possible. And things that are, the favorite of 2 out of 10 people, but sort of not interesting to 8 out of 10 people, are not going to be as valuable or as good of an investment in an unbundled space as things that are just sort of like kind of okay and medium liked by 10 out of 10 people. And so bundling, I think, promotes the creation of more specialized content, more niche content. You don't get an HGTV on cable or a Animal Planet in the early years, or Ovation, I think a now defunct network that focused on opera. These are all channels that could exist because they were owned by large conglomerates that were licensing packages of 12 channels at a time to to cable and satellite systems. This is also why you ended up with like VH1, 3, and MTV7 and ESPN 8, the Ocho, and that's an example of sort of the less good things that come out of that world. But I think bundling, promotes the existence of the kind of content that a lot of people want to exist that isn't going to be for everybody. And we live not just in a healthier business environment, but in a healthier creative environment where we allow that kind of cross subsidy to exist. And again, bundling is coming back. The key thing is nobody wants to call it the bundle. Nobody wants to call it the cable bundle. But the battle right now is for who's going to control it. So in their new carriage deals with Disney and Warner Brothers, Charter has gotten the right to bundle Disney Plus and Max ad tier subscriptions into the traditional cable package. So the old cable companies are trying to own this bundling business that they created. At the same time, the platform-oriented companies like Amazon and Apple and Roku that control sort of smart TV and set-top box devices operate channel stores. And, as of a couple of weeks ago, you can now subscribe to Apple TV Plus via Amazon, and Amazon gets a rake on that subscription. That is a kind of, the channel store is a form of bundling. And we're also going to see there's, I think, a separate movement between the cable companies on the one hand, which are trying to keep bundles very, very big and stick to the large channel offerings. And they're adding these streaming services to keep that large bundle, but give people something appealing, versus what we've heard from DirecTV and Dish Network, which are now in the process of trying to merge, both been struggling terribly, but they've indicated a desire that as part of merging, they'll have enough leverage to negotiate with the channel owners for smaller bundles. That, has been kind of a thing that people have expressed interest in. And we may have an opportunity over the next 2 years to really see in action the competition between the big bundle that incorporates linear and streaming together versus the small bundle, and see what customers respond to and what the market responds to. So moving on to sort of what and how TV is made. I use this phrase, letting television be television. So again, when Netflix emerged, it went out of its way to make the case that streaming was not television because they needed you to pay for it in a way that you had never paid for television before. And that was easier to do if you defined it as a different sort of product. And obviously, the streaming platforms are best known for very complex shows, expensive shows. Get the Breaking Bad example of the serialized drama. And there has been comparatively less investment in streaming, but this is changing in classic TV genres, procedural dramas, multicam comedies. But those we're finding are doing very well. And shows like The Night Agent, which is pretty much a CBS procedural with just a little more gloss and a little more curse words. I think a lot of the content that's on Amazon, which is often, given the title of like Dad TV, Bosch could have been a CBS show if it had less cursing and fewer shots of bare butts. And even a few shots of bare butts you can get away with if you remember Dennis Franz and NYPD Blue. So I think a movement towards classic TV genres both gives the audience something that they want, and these shows are very producible. They are easier to produce at scale. They are easier to produce for a budget. And in the long run, they are memorable in a way that these really kind of complicated shows that you can sort of only watch once. And if you might love them, but they don't have the same rewatchability. So, I say the last 20 years have given us a lot of Walter Whites and Don Drapers, but no new Lucy Ricardos. I think this is related, ultimately this is also related to the return of advertising. Advertisers like lots of episodes. Advertisers like brand safe content. I think one of the reasons why these types of genres were considered classic TV genres, they thrived in TV because they were a great fit for the needs and expectations of advertisers. And so as advertisers gain more power in streaming, I think they will encourage more investment in this type of content. And another thing that's critical about this type of content is that there's a lot more of it. So when you look at what's sort of succeeding in library stuff, shows like Friends and The Office and Suits are still among the most watched shows, original or library, in streaming. And a big part of that is because there's just so much of them and you can watch them a lot and get lost in them. You can dip in and out and not worry that if you missed an episode or two, you've like lost the thread on the plot. And I think people are taking notice of sort of what is having this kind of longevity. One of the things that I sort of posit, people talk about peak TV, especially in the early years, being a golden era of television. I wonder whether it's going to be a lost era of television. because these shows are not going to have the repeatability. They haven't, I think, in many ways, like infused the culture in the way that older shows did. And I think that, as good, and I think there's a lot of great stuff that's been made over the last 10, 15 years. I think a lot of it is not going to be remembered in another 10 or 15 years. Whereas, the shows that were sort of the iconic shows of the 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s, 2000s are going to continue to be more remembered, and hopefully shows of that type that come to us. Um, Let me quickly dip into the Q&A. Do I see more of an opportunity for independent producers to sell content for streaming platforms? Yes and no. Yes, in the sense that I think that the overall orientation toward walled gardens, everybody wanting to do everything themselves, own everything, exclusivity is diminishing. Even places like Amazon and Apple are starting to get more financial scrutiny to reduce their licensing costs, increase their revenue. Those things I think are both like well correlated with working with outside studios. On the other hand, there's going to be a lot less content. There's already a lot less content. Between 2002 and 2022, we went from about 180 scripted comedies and dramas in the US to 600. Most recently, we're down to about 500. I think that the kind of carrying capacity of the industry going forward, and people debate this, in my mind, it's probably around 350 scripted originals per year, English language. That's a lot more than it used to be, but a lot less than it's been over the last several years. And so even if there's more of a kind of institutional willingness to start working across companies again, there's also going to be fewer sales and fewer slots to go along, because frankly, we've had way too much content for several years now. Too much content to maintain quality control, but also too much content for just people to watch. Like I said, if you go from 180 to 600 in the span of about 20 years, ovulation didn't grow that much in 20 years, and there aren't any more hours in a day than there used to be. And so we're still going to go through a process of right sizing. And so it's going to be harder for everybody to sell because there's just fewer slots to go around. But I do think that in terms of like an institutional industry-wide orientation towards companies selling to each other, I think that is going to be on the rise. Last thing I'll say is these things need to cost less. It's great that streaming gave us an opportunity to have shows that had a grandeur and a scale and a scope that TV could never sustain before. It's also a problem that as, streaming became synonymous with expensive and massive fees to talent, that a simple talkie drama costs $7 million an episode. A simple talkie drama should never cost $7 million an episode. And I'd say that, this creates not just business problems, but creative problems. The example that I most like to use is The Americans, one of my favorite shows of all time and one of my favorite pilots of all time. Show on FX that went 6 seasons about a family of 2 Soviet spies living in deep cover in the U.S., raising American children, engaging in spycraft. But it's fundamentally a family drama, not a spy show. The first episode is so exciting and so taut and so cheap. And it really gets by on great camera work, great performances. And I just imagine like what would happen if the pilot of The Americans was shot for Amazon Studios. It would involve a lot more car chases and a lot more explosions, and in my view, be a lot less interesting. And so I genuinely believe that when you force people to sort of work within a box, you get the best out of them in a lot of cases. Or again, to go back to Breaking Bad, which is sort of my perennial reference. A lot of people feel that the best episode of Breaking Bad is one called Fly, directed by Rian Johnson. That is what we call a bottle episode. It's an episode that takes place with 2 characters on one set because they were running heavily over budget for the season. And in the classic production model, when you're running heavily over budget, sometimes you intentionally write an episode to be very cheap to shoot by having very few speaking parts and very few locations. That is a universally beloved episode that would not exist in a streaming financial environment because there would be no such thing as being so concerned about being over budget that you would bother doing a bottle episode. Also, look at a show like Severance that I think of as like a bottle show and has been reported to have cost about $20 million an episode. I mean, that to me is like the best example of like, this is out of control and we need to go back to making shows for reasonable dollar amounts. And that doesn't mean not supporting great art. It means remembering that this is both art and commerce. And one of the things that you'll sometimes hear frustrated creatives say, "Oh, the business people, they don't care about the creative, they don't care about the art, they just care about the numbers." And what I say is, we care about having the opportunity to continue to do this. And if we make tiny talkie dramas that should cost $3 million an episode for $20 million an episode, we're not going to continue to have the opportunity to do this. So I think of it a little bit as playing the long game. Um, uh, there's a question about back end. We're going to come to back end soon. I also need to speed up because I'm seeing the time. So I'll try to get to these Q&As, but let's go a little bit. Pilots also fell out of fashion. I know pilots, meaning making a complete episode of the show before committing to the production of a series, almost just completely ubiquitous for most of TV history. You learn a lot from a pilot. You learn a lot about the production process. You also learn a lot about, how your actors are gelling with the material and with each other. And one of the things that you really saw in great broadcast series that you don't see as much in streaming is a show morphing and evolving as the writers begin to write towards certain relationships between characters because they discovered that two actors have incredible chemistry together. The example I like to use of this is Troy and Abed on Community on NBC become this like incredible buddy duo over the show. You watch the first 6 episodes, that's not in there. That's not, part of the image of the show that they walked in with. But these two actors hit it off so well that the writers leaned into that, and it became one of the great things about the show. I think pilots, like a lot of things, were a victim of the move fast and break stuff ethos of Netflix. If it was a traditional way to do things, they didn't want to do it. And also, as they were thinking about much more complicated shows with much more complicated storylines, the focus became more, do we know that there's a plot that can carry an entire first season, that there's a plan that is important? And so pilots were largely replaced with mini rooms. At first, you found that writers and producers loved not having to go through the process of making a pilot because you didn't get paid a ton of money and it took a long time, was a lot of work. And then they kind of soured on mini rooms as well and began, missing the things that you can learn from a pilot that you can't learn from a mini room. And again, there are things that you can learn from a mini room that you can't learn from a pilot. Now I think we're moving back to a place of, again, there doesn't need to be an orthodoxy on this. Pilots are not inherently good or inherently bad. They're good if you make them for the right project at the right price. If they teach you the things that you need and want to know, that would be knowable from a mini room. If you need to do a ton of advanced effects work on a big genre play, such that a pilot is going to cost $25 million, probably wouldn't do a pilot. But if you could do a pilot for under $10 million, I think there's a tremendous amount of value there. In some ways, more or at least different value than you get from a mini room. I think pilots are also on their way back and should be. Meaningful back end, there is so much that could be said about this. This is a presentation unto itself. Suffice to say, as we're about 48 minutes into our hour, streaming broke the classic system of revenue sharing. Back end is a formula, dollars in, dollars out. It's the revenue that a show makes versus the costs that went into making and distributing and marketing it. There's further deductions, percentage modifiers. These are things that you sometimes hear about as Hollywood accounting, distribution fees off the top, overhead charges, further deductions before revenue is shared to basically compensate the studio for the overhead of all the salaries of people like me that went into making a show. But basically, everybody's incentives were aligned. Make a show, make as much money as possible from it. The more money it makes and the less you spent on it, the more money everyone makes, including the participants. But in a cost-plus world where you cannot continue to monetize the shows and other platforms, you don't have that upside. As the streamers became their own studios and had no intention of monetizing off-platform, they devised what you've heard about as dollars for point systems that essentially started with negotiating the same number of points that a participant would expect to see in a traditional deal, but then just convert those points to a cash value. And at least to date, those have generally been driven only by how many seasons are produced. There's been a big drive in the talent community for a return to success-based compensation. What you hear a lot is there are no home runs left in television, nor are there any strikeouts. There are only singles and doubles, and increasingly only singles, not doubles. One of the big themes of the WGA strike in particular and changes that were made in residuals calculation was to move back towards a system that the shows that do better, that have bigger audiences, generate higher returns for the people who created them and were key to making them. Apple has been out in the market trying to unfold a new back-end model that makes much greater use of sort of success metrics. But I think that the thing that people don't talk about now, but also need to talk about, is responsibility as part of this. Because a show's back end would be worth more or less depending on how much it costs, which is a very obvious thing. If you make $10 million on something that costs $3 million to make, you made $7 million. If you make the same $10 million on something that costs $5 million to make, you only made $5 million. And dollars for point systems, and to a lesser extent, the way that cost plus deals ran through these back end formulas, to largely insulated the outcomes on back end from being driven as much as they should be by how expensive a show is going in and whether or not it stayed on budget. And so I think that one of the things that's going to be critical here is you can't do one without the other. As we come back to rewarding shows for success, we also need to build a logic into these systems that rewards the producer who can figure out how to make a show that is 99.5% as good for 75% of the cost. Because that is worth a lot more to everybody involved in the show that is 100% as good for 100% of the cost. And for the person who sort of made a commitment to a budget and who stayed on it, I think that person should make more than the person who did not feel beholden to a budget. And one of the lines in one of my recent writings is, the best, most successful financially and creatively producers, people like Norman Lear and Lucille Ball and Dick Wolf, they don't just know how to make better TV, they know how to make TV better. And that has not been rewarded in the system that has dominated over the last 10 years. That's another thing that, I see us. And I will admit, this is one of those places where sometimes I blur the line in my own mind between what I think should happen / must happen and what I think will happen. I will choose to be optimistic and kind of treat those as the same thing right now. And I do think that there are movements in this direction, but a lot of this stuff represents collective action problems. It's good in the aggregate, but it's very difficult to get there. And there's a lot of incentives along the way that make it difficult to move in this direction. Everybody loves the idea of a success-based system until they realize that they might do worse in it. All of a sudden, they're not such a fan of that system. So it's going to be, a period of years and a conflict-ridden period to move in these directions. But again, I think critical, and I think that for the first time in a long time, there is a broad consensus among a lot of constituencies that this is necessary for the long-term health of the business. Also, professional experience and development. This is another thing that if you heard John Landgraf's appearance on The Town in the last week, that I thought was just one of the most important things that he focused on is, we have a training and mentorship crisis, I would say, at all levels, in the executive ranks, in the production ranks, and the writer ranks. In TV, traditionally, the writer-creator is the showrunner. They are a writer-producer. Producer is a very different job from writer, and I have worked with showrunners who are great writers and not very good producers. I've worked with ones that are great producers and not very good writers, and it's a rare and beautiful thing to work with somebody who's a great writer and a great producer, but those are the people who really generate the biggest successes, and also run the best productions. And as we've moved over the last 15 years, from a normal 22 episodes per season of television to 13 to 12 to 10 to 8 to 6 frequently now. Writers' rooms getting shorter, fewer writers being on shows. There's an interesting story to be told, and it is told in the book, about kind of like one foot in front of the other, step by step, people making decisions that felt good or necessary in the moment. But when you sort of take a step back and see where they've led you, they've led us to a place where we have a little bit of a lost generation of talent, of writers who may know a lot about writing, but don't know very much about producing. We've welcomed feature talent into the TV world, feature writers in part being, attracted with the promise that they can have so much more influence in TV than they've ever been able to have in features, which are much more of a director-driven medium. But they don't have the producing skills associated with that. And so that's sort of what I mean. The peak TV and the vicious cycle of writer professional development, the more we shorten these orders, the more we shorten the work opportunities and learning opportunities for these writers, the less value they added, the less incentive there was to spend money on creating opportunities for them, the less opportunities we created for them, the worse they got, the less value they added. And I think that's been a process that's played out over a period of years. In the WGA's focus during the strike last year on minimum staffing, I think minimum staffing was understood and discussed largely as kind of like a base employment protection, making sure that a certain number of writers are at least getting employed and getting paid. I think it would have been much more valuable and much more meaningful to focus it on solving a problem of the training crisis and making sure that we are keeping writers and using them, keep them in a position and using them in a way that prepares them to become the next generation of creators. and showrunners. But look, it's a double-edged sword, and the problem is if you're going to value experience, it does end up meaning, just because of the reality of the last 50 years or more, it means keeping a lot of old white men in charge. And, we've tried to balance the desire to open up access to, underrepresented voices, to kind of get people into these rooms and into positions as creators who've never had these opportunities. But I also think we do these people a disservice when we throw them into these positions without then having kind of learned the ropes. And now they go in, and it's very hard to succeed when they've essentially been made the CEO of the company of their um uh, a show is a company that spins up and hires a bunch of people and then ceases to exist when the show is done. And if the showrunner is the president or the CEO of the company, it's tough to ask someone to be the president or the CEO when they've only ever been like a bottom level employee before. There's a lot that you need to know, but you also, again, have to not kind of like fall back into the trap that it's just the same 50 people hiring their same 50 friends over and over again. There's not easy solutions to that. The most I can say is it's the thing that we need to be aware of and make part of our process and our thinking. Uh, and finally, the social and cultural experience of TV. So there's a question here that I haven't gone to about YouTube. I used to think of YouTube and Snapchat and ABOD, these kinds of smaller platforms, as part of television, a species of television. The first edition of my book proposes a very broad definition of television: audiovisual content delivered to the viewer at times and places on devices of their choosing that was intentionally designed to include YouTube. I no longer view those kinds of platforms. I don't think that TikTok is a form of television. I don't think that YouTube is a form of television in the way that I used to. And I can, again, it's a longer presentation for why what happened with Quibi was very impactful in my thinking about that. I do write about this more in the book. But I do think that these businesses, they are still part of a common attention economy. We are still competing with short form, TikTok, YouTube, also with video games, live events and experiences for people's finite leisure hours and people's finite leisure dollars. And so I think we compete effectively as a TV industry, not by trying to copy those people, but by doing the things that TV does best. And I think one of those things that TV has long done best was, creating a social experience and a commonality of culture. That can't be fully, recreated, because we live in a world with the internet and more than 3 to 4 broadcast networks. The days when 100 million people were watching the same thing at the same time on a regular basis, or at least 70 million people, are long gone, unless it's football. Then 70 to 100 million people are watching it. But we need to, I think, as an industry, get creative about how to generate these social experiences, because I think that is what will make TV more valuable to people and, motivate people to seek out TV. If people feel that by watching TV and that they're watching at the same time that their friends and family are watching, that they have the opportunity to have what we used to call the water cooler conversations on a Monday. I mean, if you worked in Hollywood, you had to watch Succession on Sunday because you knew what was going to be discussed in the stat meeting on Monday. That's the last time that I can remember that experience, but that's also very niche. That wasn't representative of broader society. That was representative of Hollywood. And that brings me to my last point, which is Hollywood sometimes forgets when it's programming for itself versus programming for the broader audience. CBS has perennially been the most watched broadcast network. Young Sheldon has been the most watched comedy for a long time. NCIS has been the most watched drama for a long time. These shows are not high art. They would not be described by anyone probably as premium. But they are comforting. They are easy to watch. They attract broad audiences. And sometimes you hear an almost sense of disdain from the creative community in Hollywood of like making this stuff for the hoi polloi. And then anytime something like a Sound of Freedom comes about, or a Yellowstone, and Hollywood is just like shocked to discover that there is such an appetite and such a market for this kind of, more, middle American, for lack of a better term, content. Why are we constantly surprised? And I think it's only because, most Hollywood people begrudgingly participate in making this. But I think if TV is going to maintain its social and cultural power, it is and has always been a populist medium. Again, I don't want to stop making high art, but I don't want to leave the audience behind. because I think if we do and we lose the connection between TV and culture, we do lose our ability to compete with TikTok and YouTube for people's attention. And that is 59 minutes. So I will stop right there. That's the end of the official presentation. I can stay a couple extra minutes if people are interested to tackle some Q&A that was in the box that we didn't get to, if there's a demand for that, or it's 1:30, you can all go on with your lives.
Hi, Ken, it's Randy. Feel free if you would wanted to answer one or two other questions you didn't get to.
Yeah. Okay. So the first one that's in front of me are projects that have additional content points beyond the script or pilot. Graphic novels, web series, plays, books in a better or worse position for consideration. Definitely a better position, but not necessarily for good reasons. Uh, People love IP. Um, it's a defensive move. It reflects the fear culture of entertainment. It reflects an entertainment environment in which people are constantly afraid of being fired. In which they have very minimal discretion to own things, like executives, mid to even senior like executives are much less in power in Hollywood today than they were 20, 30 years ago. Um, this is tied to kind of the gerontocracy of the C-suite still being populated by septuagenarians who've been in their chairs for 30 to 40 years and not really given up the reins of power. But IP does great because it reduces the risk of saying yes. It gives people something to show their boss as a justification. Like, yeah, you can make all of these theoretical arguments. Oh, it comes with an audience. Oh, it gives you a pathway for the story. And I think those things are seldom really meaningful, or at least seldom meaningfully captured. It just it makes it easier to say yes. It makes it easier for people to go to their bosses and ask for a yes. And that's kind of reason enough for it to have power in this market. How is it determined whether a series is successful in streaming? Good question. Ask the streamers. They don't want to tell anybody. They have their own metrics. Netflix, which sort of created the culture of radical data untransparency in streaming, now that it is the most powerful streaming service with the most subscribers and the most hours of total content being viewed, has become the most transparent among them. But it's a power move. It's a way to show the market how much more viewership their stuff has than other people. It's also a way to tell certain aspects of the market, the creative community, that your critical darling of a show that people really love on Twitter and are passionate about on social media isn't actually watched by a lot of people. So don't ask for a ton of money for future seasons because it's not the success that you're able to construct a narrative around it. Whereas, I remember being in a position of several years ago renegotiating deals for actors on a successful streaming series. And because there was no publicly available data of any kind, they were telling me about social media mentions, about the lawyers were telling me how often their client was referenced on social media. The show was referenced on social media. And I was like, I don't know what that means. And I don't know if I should care about that. And all the streamers do have their own sort of metrics. They have their ways of trying to attribute customer subscription decisions to specific pieces of content by looking at customer behavior, the timing of what and how you consume things relative to when you subscribe. But they do remain very proprietary about that. I think they will long remain proprietary about what they think are the most important advanced metrics. But again, I think as advertising becomes more important and more powerful, the advertisers will demand more transparency. They'll demand more and better data that will eventually, make its way to more public forums. It will eventually have a bigger impact on how talent deals are negotiated, and contingent compensation for talent, on how studio deals and licenses are negotiated. But it is a multi-year process to get through that for sure. Let's do one more before we wrap it up. Where should independent producers look to sell their content other than YouTube? The short answer is anywhere and everywhere they can. Sony, I often hold up as an example of like Sony's, the lifeblood of Sony's business has been to be the first studio in the door and every new content platform before the model is proven, when it's still speculative, when it's still risky. Sony, along with Warner Brothers Television, was the first major outside studio to produce for FX in the early 2000s. With Lionsgate, it was the first major outside studio to produce for AMC in the late, aughts, mid to late aughts. It was on Lifetime. It was one of the first into Amazon, first into Netflix. That mentality is what independents need, is take risks on new places, and especially take risks on places that are allowing you to bet on yourself. One of the things that I think really haunts the current industry is that even for the really entrepreneurial producers and studios out there who want to bet on their own success, who are willing to risk money, there's very few opportunities to do so. I'd had this conversation with presidents and heads of business affairs at kind of major independent studios, and they say, if I even want to take a risk and take a deficit, there's about 3 platforms in town that I can even have the option of making that deal. And all the major platforms where the talent want to be, I can beg for them to pay me less and for me to take more risk. And it's not their model. And I don't have an opportunity to bet on myself. So again, I would say invest in new platforms. Look for the opportunity. AMC wasn't AMC until there was Breaking Bad and Mad Men. And then those were the brand. FX wasn't FX until there was The Shield and Damages and Justified, and that was the brand. The people who invest early on from the content development production side had the opportunity to define the brand. And I think there's a lot of power in that.
Okay, well, on behalf of the Beverly Hills Bar Association, I would like to thank you, Ken, for this invaluable insight you provided today. And for all our audience, I also strongly recommend Ken's book. I personally recently got the most up-to-date copy, and I'm very excited about it. So I wanted to.
It's available on Amazon.
It's available on Amazon. Well, thank you very much.
Yep. The other thing I will say for those who are, oh wow, more people than I expected who are still in the conference is, I welcome everybody's feedback. And I am thinking about creating a kind of a subscription supplement. I just yesterday discovered the first error in my book, not a typo, but a thing that I said was just wrong. If you're curious, it's on page 119 and page 240. I say that the minimum staffing rules in first seasons are just showrunner +2, and that the higher staff requirements for more episodes apply in the second season onward. That's not true. It's based on the number of episodes from the first season onward. The reason I made that mistake is because it is true that for pre-green light development rooms, there's different rules for first versus subsequent seasons. My soul is hurting right now because the problem with the book is I can't go back and fix that. But I've been thinking about creating a subscription service to, own and correct those mistakes, continue to enhance the book. It was 6 years between the first and second editions. It's almost certainly going to be at least that between the second and third. If that's something that people would find interesting and valuable, please give me that feedback, because that would be very impactful on whether I choose to go in that direction.
Well, thank you very much. I, for one, encourage you to do that. So that's my vote. Well, thank you again, and everyone have a nice and safe Halloween.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
You may be eligible for CLE credit in your state. Visit bhba.org/podcasts for more information.